What is it about that one chord that seems to just grab a hold of all of our emotions and create an incredibly beautiful resolution? Let's dive into it. Yikes! John Williams loves to use this minor 4 chord in so many of his works, and it is always absolutely stunning, and this is a perfect application of that. So this is Leia's theme from Star Wars. So we're in D major, that's our home base. Now, if we look at all of the chords that exist in D major just using the notes of the scale, right? They would be D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, A major, B minor, and then C sharp diminished, and that leads us back to D. So those, what you might call the diatonic, like the naturally existing chords within the D major sound. We're starting in this, that's our first chord. Something about the middle lower brass playing that particular melody. Oh man. Whoo, wow. It's just an absolutely incredible change that you're kind of not expecting. And there's a very specific reason for that. Notice what we just talked about. In relation to D major, all of our chords notice what the naturally occurring 4 chord is in a major context. It's major. There's a B natural in there in this G chord, which of course makes it a major chord. So when we establish that we're existing in this space of D major as sort of our home base, all of a sudden we're setting expectations. That's what we expect to hear. In the context of D major, the most naturally occurring chords, that 4 is major. So when we make that change, that minor third within that G chord that obviously makes it minor, that's subverting our expectations from what we've established by saying, hey, this song is in D major. We immediately just jump to this, whoa. We can do that in so many different ways. We don't necessarily have to go to G minor in order to create an unexpected change. I mean, why then does it not have the same impact if I go from D major to, I don't know, A flat minor? Just going from D to A flat minor. Very unexpected, but yet it doesn't have the same impact as the minor 4 chord does. Something about that is uniquely beautiful. How is it specifically keying in on that? Ooh, let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at our naturally occurring 4 chord in the key of D major, and that is G major. One thing we're going to start to talk about here are resolutions. A resolution is when a chord draws itself back to a home base. There's a couple ways to do that. The strongest resolution, as we've talked about many times on this channel, is a 5-1. That's perhaps the most common sound in music. Oftentimes it's preceded by a 2. The 2-5-1 is perhaps the most commonly used sound in jazz especially, and one of the most common sounds in music in general. And it works so well because it's drawing us to that final place of our home base. In this case, it's D major. Our ears are like, yes, yes, and yes. Now we're home, it feels complete, we're done. Here's why those work so well. What we're gonna look at are the chord tones of each of these chords. In particular, one of the most common ways that you're going to hear that 5 chord used is as a dominant chord with a flat 7. That dominant sound is perhaps the strongest resolution. That's why you can always go, it drives people nuts. Just finish it, right? Why is that happening? Well, let's look at the notes in that chord. So in that chord, we have A, C sharp, E, and G. That is an A dominant chord. Now, I want you to look at that chord, and now I want you to look at the D major chord that we're going to. We have A, D, and F sharp, okay? Now here's the secret to resolutions. This is why a 5-1 works so well. We are looking for what we might call leading tones. Tones of the chord that need to move as little as possible, usually a half step, to get to their next place. Well, let's talk about A first, the root of the dominant chord. A is a shared note. It's a common tone between A and D, right? So A is gonna stay exactly where it is. That's not gonna move because it exists here and it exists here. So we know that that's good. Well, what about C sharp? Well, C sharp does not exist in the chord that we're going to. Where did it move? We have C sharp here. The root of the next chord is only a half step away. It's D. That's all we're doing is going from C sharp to D. Let's take a look at the next note in A dominant. That's E. Well, E, you could say, could kind of go either way, but it's not a half step away from any chord tone in D major where we're trying to land. Rather, it's a whole step away from two different chord tones in D. It's a whole step from that root, or it's a whole step from F sharp, which is the third of D. So that E is not as much what you consider a leading tone because it's a little further away than a half step. Rather, it could kind of go either way, but that C sharp to D is a little more compelling because it's so much closer, right? Well, let's take a look at our final note in A dominant, G. What is G in comparison to where we're landing? The closest note to it is F sharp, the third of our root chord, D major. And that's only a half step away from F sharp. So we could consider that a leading tone as well. So what we have in A dominant 7 are two leading tones. They're just dying to be resolved to our home base of D major. That's why a 5-7 chord, in this case A dominant, is so compelling and is such a great tension builder to release into our root, our home base. In this case, it's D major. So we have two notes that are just dying to be resolved. You can hear that entire chord progression with just those two notes. I don't need to play anything else. You know exactly what that is. If I filled the rest of it in, you know what it would sound like just by these two notes. They're that strong. That is what we might call a traditional cadence of a 5 to a 1. What happens when we approach it from the other side of the circle of fifths? This is basically a fancy way of saying rather than going 5-1, we're gonna go 4-1. Now notice that's also a very nice cadence. That's what we call a plagal cadence. It's a cadence that's coming from the other side of the key circle, and it's not quite as strong as the traditional cadence of 5-1. So there's a very specific reason why this plagal cadence is generally thought to be not quite as powerful as a traditional cadence. Let's look at that. When we looked at the A dominant chord, we were looking for those leading tones, the tones that were one half step away from where we are trying to land in our home base of D major. Well, let's take a look at G major, this plagal cadence. Let's look at the notes that are in there and where they have to move to create our home base of D major. Now we're looking for half steps, mind you. So one thing we can immediately point out is that both chords share this D. They both share a D. So that's gonna stay exactly where it is. Now let's look at our B in the G major chord. Where does that need to move to resolve? Well, it's gonna move down to an A. That is a very nice resolution, but it is not a leading tone in the same concept as we were thinking of with our 5 chord to our 1. This instead is a whole step from B to A. Okay, so far we have a common tone and we have a whole step resolution. Very nice sounding, but not quite as strong as our half step resolutions. Let's look at our final note, G. So G, now that is a leading tone. That is gonna be that half step away from where it needs to resolve in the key of D, and that's from G to F sharp. Half step away, very nice resolution. That's why it's a little darker sounding than but beautiful in its own way. What happens when we flip that chord minor? This is why this chord works so incredibly well. We established that it's subverting our expectations, but why does it resolve so strongly? Check this out. Notice how we said that one of the resolutions in our plagal cadence from G to D was this B to A movement, the major third of G moving to the fifth of D, and that was a whole step resolution. What did we change about G major to make it minor? Well, we take that third and we make it minor. There we go. Here is our minor 4 chord. Look at what we just did. We just created the exact same powerful resolution that our 5 chord to our 1 has, only we did it on the 4th step of the scale, on this G chord, the 4 chord in the key of D. Because this B flat only has to move a half step to become A, that makes it a leading tone. That makes it a more powerful resolution to our 1 chord, which gives it the same weight that our 5 chord has. We said that this is the most powerful resolution. All of a sudden, we've taken the number of leading tones that our 5 chord has, and we've now added that same number of leading tones to our 4 chord. We have a B flat that resolves to an A, and we have a G that resolves to an F sharp. Those are both leading tones. They're both half-step resolutions. How cool is that? Here's where it gets even more interesting. Let's take another example. Let's take a look at the Beatles. What did we do there? We had our minor 4 to 1 resolution, but we also had our major 4. We started here and changed it minor. So not only do we have this super strong resolution of 4, minor 4 to 1, but we also included the major 4 first, and then we changed it minor. Watch what's happening there. Okay, so when we have our major 4 chord, we're using B natural, right? That's the third in the chord of G major. And then when we make that minor, we drop that third to a minor third, and then when we go to our 1 chord from our minor 4, which is D major, we now resolve that down a half step again. So we've now created a resolution of this one single note, this inner voice movement. That's a beautiful resolution of this single note moving chromatically to finally resolve to our 1 chord. So when we include the major 4, then the minor 4, then our 1 chord, not only are we subverting expectations by including a chord that doesn't naturally exist in the key of D major by including that minor 4, we're also creating a nice inner voice movement to resolve, and we're creating that plagal cadence with this strong, compelling resolution with 2 leading tones, B flat and G. Everything about this is harmonically and melodically perfect. And it's just the right amount of surprise when we hear it that it invokes that emotional response. It almost feels like the music that uses this has a sad feeling, but there's something weirdly sentimental and happy about it. There's so much music that you can look to as an example of this. Using that minor 4 chord, it's enough of a curveball while being still such a compelling resolution. It's a chord that you almost can't hear without crying. It's one of my favorite chords that's used in film scores, and there's tons of great examples in some of the most famous songs ever. I geek out over the minor 4 chord every time I hear it. So I want to know, what are some things that I haven't heard that you guys know of that makes such a great usage of this? That happy, sad feeling of it's so powerful. That minor plagal cadence with the same exact pull, the 2 leading tones that our 5 chord usually has. What a cool device. I will look forward to reading your recommendations down in the comments below. Let me know in the comments below all the examples you have of that minor 4 in use. What's the music that makes you sob uncontrollably and look like a complete mess? Thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.